On the edge of a dying frontier, a soldier returned from war with nothing but scars. One drunken night sealed his fate. Instead of the noose, the council gave him a punishment meant to break him: marriage to a young Apache woman, sold for $5 and cast aside like property. But what began in shame would become a story of firelight, silence, survival, and a love neither of them expected. The desert town lay quiet under the weight of dusk, its main street painted in the dim orange of a fading sun. Dust hung in the air like smoke from a fire long since burned out. Wagons creaked their way homeward, shutters were drawn against the wind, and dogs barked without conviction before curling back into themselves. The day was dying, but the town still gathered at its center, restless and waiting for spectacle. Jonas Hale was dragged up the steps of the council hall by two men who had once called him neighbor. His wrists were bound by rough rope, though. He did not fight them. He walked with the stiff shoulders of a man too tired to resist, his boots leaving dull marks in the wooden planks. His face bore a bruise along the jaw. The fading echo of a fight started in whiskey and ended in shame. Inside, the air was thick with bodies and judgment. Lanterns hissed and popped in the corners. The men of the council sat behind a table scarred by years of decisions and disputes, and in their eyes there was neither pity nor rage, only a practical weariness. They had grown accustomed to handling broken men. Jonas Hale, once a soldier, once a farmer with a wife and a home, now stood among them with little more than his rifle and his bitterness. "You know what you did," said the eldest councilman, a wiry figure with tobacco stains at the corners of his mouth. "Could lock you up, could hang you, some would say." Murmurs swelled from the crowd gathered near the doorway. Wives clutching shawls, boys straining for a look. Jonas lifted his head but did not speak. Words had left him long ago, somewhere in the fields of war or in the lonely nights that followed. "But we have another way," the councilman continued, "a punishment fitting for a man who cannot keep his place among decent folk." The door opened then, and two more men entered. Between them walked a woman, her hands bound, though she did not stumble. She was younger than Jonas had expected, her frame narrow, her step steady. Her dress was threadbare, the hem stained from earth and travel. Her hair, black as crow feathers, hung in two long braids over her shoulders, the last possession of dignity she carried. "This one was sold to the settlement," the councilman said flatly, as though she were no more than a mule or a wagon wheel. "Cost $5 to keep her from being traded off to worse hands. Apache stock. No family here, no standing. We give her to you, Jonas Hale. You will marry her, and in her keeping, find the weight of your disgrace." The hall filled, with the sound of whispers of scorn disguised as laughter. A punishment meant not only for Jonas but for the woman as well. A binding of two castaways, one a fallen soldier, the other a stranger torn from her people. Jonas's jaw tightened, but he gave no protest. To fight would be to admit a wound. To speak would be to reveal weakness. He nodded once, slow, as if lowering his head beneath a yoke. The councilman signaled, and the matter was settled. The marriage was performed that evening in the dim church at the end of the street. Half the town crowded the pews, eager for the strange sight. The minister's voice trembled through the vows, as though uncertain whether heaven itself would acknowledge the union. Jonas stood stiff in his worn coat, his hands raw and scarred, from years of work and war. The woman, her name spoken once, Naeli, kept her gaze lowered, her silence as steady as the stone floor beneath her feet. When it was done, there was no kiss, no cheer. Only a silence filled with sneers, and the sound of boots shuffling as the crowd spilled back into the night, satisfied with its punishment delivered. Jonas led her to his homestead on the far edge of the desert, a lonely cabin weathered by sand and time. The ride out was wordless. His horse clopped steadily along the road, the wagon trailing behind with the woman seated in the back. The moon rose, pale and unfeeling, over the horizon. At the cabin, Jonas dismounted and opened the door. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and dust, of a life long abandoned. The hearth was cold. A rocking chair sat in the corner, its arms worn smooth, a ghost of the woman he had lost before. A trunk rested by the wall, locked and untouched. Holding memories he had never dared to disturb, he motioned for Naeli to enter. She did so without hesitation, her eyes sweeping across the room, noting its emptiness, its silence. Jonas untied the rope at her wrists, the coarse fibers leaving red marks against her skin. She rubbed them briefly, then folded her hands in front of her as though to hide the evidence. He set a blanket on the small bed against the far wall, then dragged his chair closer to the fire pit. Striking a match, he coaxed flame from dry kindling, the sparks lighting his face in fits of gold and shadow. He did not look at her, and she did not speak to him. Two strangers bound not by love or choice, but by punishment. Outside, coyotes called across the dark, their cries sharp against the silence of the land. Inside, Jonas stared into the fire until his eyes blurred. His shame sat heavy upon him. First cast out by the world of war, now cast out by the only community left to weigh him. Across the room, Naeli lay down upon the bed, her braids falling across her shoulder like black rivers. Her face betrayed nothing, though inside she carried the weight of her own abandonment, her own rejection by a world that had stripped her name down to a price. The night stretched long, filled with silence that was not empty but crowded, with shame, with grief, with the unspoken knowledge that neither belonged, yet both were now bound beneath the same roof. The fire crackled, and the desert wind pressed against the walls, and in that uneasy quiet began the story of Jonas Hale and Naeli, two lives joined not by mercy but by judgment. Morning came quietly at the homestead, not with rooster's crow or cheerful bustle, but with the hollow sound of wind against the boards. The desert sun broke slow over the horizon, painting the land in pale gold, but inside the cabin, the air felt heavy, as though the night silence had never lifted. Jonas rose early as he always did, his boots sliding across the floor with the scrape of habit. He poured water into a basin, splashed his face, and said nothing. Naeli was already awake, though she had not stirred the fire yet. She sat by the small window, shawl pulled close, her gaze fixed on the land beyond. Her stillness unnerved him, though he would not admit it even to himself. Work filled his days, though little of it was necessary. Jonas chopped wood until his shoulders ached, mended fences that had not yet fallen, repaired tools that bore no cracks. Anything to keep his hands busy, to drown the quiet. Yet when the work was done, there was nothing left but to sit on the porch with his rifle across his knees, staring into the horizon as though it might offer him an answer. Inside, Naeli moved through the cabin like smoke. She swept dust from the corners, though the wind brought it back by evening. She boiled coffee over the fire, the smell rising bitter and familiar. She mended what clothes there were, stitching carefully, her fingers scarred but steady. She spoke, no words to him, and he gave her none in return. At night, when the lamps dimmed and the fire gave only embers, they slept under the same roof, but the silence between them was thicker than the walls, a gulf wide as the desert itself. It was in the small moments that their ghosts revealed themselves. Jonas would pause by the trunk near the bed, its iron latch rusted yet unbroken. Inside lay a folded shawl, worn thin, its edges frayed, the last garment of his late wife. He had buried her on the rise behind the homestead years ago, a stone, marker, and nothing more. Sometimes he would touch the trunk as though it were still warm from her hands. His chest would tighten, and he would turn away quickly before the memory drowned him. Naeli carried her past differently. Her braids were long now, thick and shining, but once they had been shorn in cruelty, cut short by the hands of those who took her. She had stood in shame then, stripped of her womanhood, her dignity scattered on the ground. She never spoke of it, but in the careful way she bound her braids each morning, Jonas saw a ritual of reclamation, a defiance whispered in silence. The town did not forget Jonas. Men in the saloon spoke of him with laughter sharp as knives. Prison of his own making, they called his home. Women shook their heads when his name was mentioned, pity in their eyes for the soldier turned drunk, turned fool with an Indian wife. Yet the words did not reach him directly. He kept away from the settlement, and they kept their scorn alive in his absence. At the homestead, small gestures began to shift the air. On mornings when Jonas left his chair cold and went outside to split wood, he would return to find his coffee poured and waiting. The blanket he left on the back of the chair would be drawn across his shoulders if he dozed by the fire. Nayeli did these things without word, without expectation. Jonas noticed. Though his face betrayed nothing, though he never spoke of it, he saw the care behind each act, quiet as the touch of a hand on the wind. Shame burned in him for accepting kindness he could not return, and yet he did not push it away. One evening, after a day spent mending fence posts in the dry wind, Jonas lingered outside longer than usual. The desert was purple with twilight, coyotes crying in the distance. He leaned on his rifle, the barrel cold under his palm. Through the cabin window he saw Nayeli's shadow, bent over her stitching by the firelight. The sight struck him strangely, not of punishment, not of humiliation, but of a life continuing quiet and unbroken despite all that had been done to her. That night, the silence felt different. It was not lighter, not yet, but no longer hostile. Something in it had softened, like earth after rain. Jonas lay awake long after the fire sank to ash, staring at the ceiling beams above him. He thought of the war, of the widow's shawl folded in the trunk of the drink that had dulled his grief until it burned him raw, and now of this woman beside him in the room, bound to him by the judgment of others. She was no ghost, no shadow of the past. She was a presence, living, enduring. Her bed Nayeli lay still, her braids spread like dark rivers across the blanket. Her eyes were open to the dark, remembering voices in a tongue Jonas did not know, voices that had called her daughter sister kin. She had been taken from them, traded, silenced. And yet she breathed, she endured, she wove her life thread in a place that called her foreign. Neither spoke, but both knew. Abandonment haunted them in different forms. Widowhood had taken one. Captivity had taken the other. Yet both carried scars that did not fade. Both bore grief that did not rest. In the silence, something faint stirred. Not companionship, not yet trust, but recognition. A shared loneliness, a mirror in the other's quiet. The gulf between them remained vast, but for the first time they both felt it was not entirely uncrossable. The fire gave a last crack before collapsing into coals. Jonas turned on his side. Nayeli closed her eyes, and in the quiet of that long night they remained, two strangers, two exiles, bound not only by punishment, but by the heavy shadows of their pasts. The horizon blackened in the span of an hour, as though night had decided to arrive early. The desert wind, usually dry and steady, came ragged, pulling dust into the air until the land vanished in a haze of shifting brown. Jonas knew the signs. Storms came fast in this country, sudden and merciless. He tightened the strap on his hat and moved quickly, his boots crunching across the yard as he secured what could be saved. Shutters were nailed down, the barn door braced with a heavy beam. Chickens were driven inside, their squawking drowned by the rising roar of wind. Jonas worked with the efficiency of habit, his shoulders rolling under strain. When he looked up, the sky was a wall of iron, thunder muttering low as a warning yet to be fulfilled. From the corner of his eye he caught movement on the ridge. A horse, a rider bent low in the saddle. The figure grew clear against the storms. Pale backdrop, a man with a wide-brimmed hat and a rifle across his back. He rode hard, as though fleeing the darkness that chased him. Jonas's mouth pressed into a line. Visitors seldom came this far, unless they needed something, and need often brought trouble. Still, when the rider drew up before the cabin, rain already spitting against the earth, Jonas stepped forward. The stranger swung down with the casual grace of a man used to travel. He was lean, sharp-eyed, with a half-smile that never touched his gaze. His coat was worn but well-kept, and beneath it glinted the butt of a revolver. "Storm's coming fast," the man said, voice rough with the road. "Figured you wouldn't mind me riding it out under a roof." Jonas's jaw tightened. He measured the stranger with a long look, then nodded once. "Storm doesn't care for manners. Come in." The man led his horse to the barn with practiced ease, then followed Jonas inside. The cabin smelled of smoke and coffee, of wood rubbed old by use. Nayeli sat near the hearth, her hands busy with mending, though her eyes lifted when the door opened. The stranger's gaze lingered on her longer than courtesy allowed. He tipped his hat, smile widening. "Didn't expect to find company out here. You've got yourself a peculiar household." Jonas said nothing. He hung his hat on the peg and reached for kindling, coaxing flame into life. The storm pressed against the walls, thunder cracking nearer. Rain struck the roof in hard, steady sheets. The stranger settled himself as though he owned the chair, stretching long legs toward the fire. "Strange wife you've got, Hale," he said lightly. "Town talked plenty when I passed through. Didn't figure the stories were true." Jonas's grip tightened on the iron poker, but he kept his voice level. "Stories don't interest me." The man chuckled, his eyes never leaving Nayeli. "Maybe they should. A woman like that, quiet, eyes sharp, don't belong bound to a man with your kind of luck. Shame, really." Nayeli kept her head bowed, though her hands stilled on the fabric in her lap. Her braids hung forward, black cords catching the firelight. Only the flicker of unease in her gaze betrayed what she felt. The storm raged louder, wind clawing at the shutters, rattling them like bones. The cabin seemed smaller with the stranger inside, each breath weighted with tension. Jonas sat with his rifle across his knees, the gesture casual to an untrained eye, but his knuckles whitened against the wood. Hours dragged. Lightning split the sky, thunder rolling like cannon fire. The stranger spoke little after that, though his glances remained sly and unrelenting. Jonas dozed finally in his chair, the weariness of long labor and longer silence pulling him down. The storm's lullaby was steady, violent, endless. It happened quickly. The stranger rose from his seat with deliberate quiet, boots soft against the floorboards. Nayeli stiffened where she sat, eyes wide now, sewing dropped forgotten to the ground. His shadow loomed over her, his hand reaching as if to touch what was not his. Jonas woke with the instinct of a soldier, sharp, sudden, furious. His eyes snapped open, and in the same breath his rifle swung up, barrel striking the stranger's chest before words could be spoken. The drifter snarled and shoved back. Furniture splintered, the rocking chair collapsing under weight as fists flew. The room filled with the chaos of struggle, wood cracking, breath grunted through clenched teeth. Jonas fought with the strength of a man defending more than pride, his fists driven by a fire long buried. The stranger drew his knife, but Jonas slammed his arm against the table, the blade clattering useless to the floor. With a final heave, Jonas threw the man against the door. It burst open beneath the force, rain and wind tearing inside as the drifter staggered out into the storm. He scrambled to his horse, curses torn from his throat. "You'll pay for this, Hale," he shouted, voice carried ragged by thunder. Then he was gone, swallowed by the storm's fury. Jonas stood in the doorway, chest heaving, rain plastering his hair to his brow. He lowered the rifle slowly, the heat of anger cooling to the dull ache of survival. Behind him, the cabin lay, in disarray, chair broken, table skewed, embers scattered but still burning. Nayeli had not moved. She sat with her shawl clutched close, eyes fixed on Jonas as though seeing him for the first time. When he turned back inside, closing the door against the storm, their eyes met. For a long moment, silence returned. Not empty, not cold, but alive, with the memory of what had just passed. Jonas dropped the rifle into its stand, then sank heavily to the edge of the broken chair. His hands trembled faintly, not from fear, but from the weight of what had nearly been. Then Nayeli rose. She stepped close, slow and careful, until she stood beside him. Her hand, scarred and steady, touched his arm once, light as breath but firm with meaning. Gratitude, recognition, something wordless that did not need translation. Jonas did not speak. He only nodded, and for the first time the silence between them felt less like a wall and more like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, there was quiet. The storm passed in the night, but its weight lingered. The land smelled of wet dust, of cedar split by lightning, of earth rinsed clean yet unsettled. Jonas woke early, stepping out into a morning painted gray, the air sharp with the scent of rain still trapped in the soil. The cabin behind him stood intact, though the door bore scars where it had been flung open, and the rocking chair inside lay splintered. Silence hung heavier now than before. Not the hollow silence of strangers forced together, but something tauter, stretched, thin by the memory of violence, by the memory of her hand on his arm. Jonas found himself unsettled. He had expected anger or perhaps disdain, but instead there had been warmth. It left him restless, uneasy. He busied himself more than ever, hammering at fence posts, splitting logs with unnecessary force, carrying buckets of water until his arms ached. Anything to push down the thought of it. Nayeli, too, felt the shift. She moved through the days with her usual stillness, but when her eyes brushed against his, she looked away quickly. Trust was no easy seed to plant in soil such as theirs. Yet she did not shrink from him, nor avoid his presence. If anything, the rhythm of their work began to fall in step, her gathering kindling while he chopped, her stitching leather while he oiled the harness. They moved like two rivers running parallel, close, but never touching. Winter whispered at the edges of the land. Nights grew long, winds sharper. Jonas stacked firewood until the pile reached the eaves, his breath fogging in the early mornings. Nayeli mended every scrap of cloth she could salvage, fashioning mittens from old shirts, patching worn coats. She did not ask, and he did not instruct, yet both prepared for the same cold. It was during one such preparation that Jonas brought forth something he had not touched in years. From the trunk at the foot of his bed, he unfolded a shawl, faded, edges frayed, the scent of cedar faint upon it. His late wife's. He held it in his hands a long while, thumb brushing the worn embroidery, before carrying it to the hearth where Nayeli sat. Without a word, he placed it beside her and stepped back, his face shadowed by the fire's glow. Nayeli looked at it, then at him. Her fingers lingered on the cloth, tracing the threadbare edges. She did not speak thanks, yet her silence carried weight, an acknowledgement deeper than words. She draped it across her shoulders, and for the first time, the cabin felt less like punishment and more like shelter. In return, Nayeli left a symbol of her own. One morning, Jonas went to the barn and found his horse waiting with a braid woven neatly into its mane. Simple, firm, practical. It was a mark of belonging, quiet and undeniable. He touched it, felt the texture of her work beneath his calloused hand, and said nothing. Yet something within him shifted, as though a stone long lodged in his chest had begun to move. The days shortened. Snow came at last, drifting soft across the desert floor, muffling the world into stillness. Jonas and Nayeli worked side by side beneath the pale sky, their breath clouding in the air. The land was harsh, but the rhythm of their tasks was steady, carrying them from morning to night. One evening, as flakes swirled outside and the fire blazed bright, Jonas sat quietly, watching her. Nayeli folded cloth with scarred hands, her face lit by the warm flicker of flame. There was no softness in her scars, no pretense of fragility, only a steady strength. She bore silence as another might bear armor, and in that stillness he saw dignity, a kind of endurance he himself had never mastered. For years his anger had been his companion, his drink his only weapon against the hollow ache of loss. But watching her, Jonas felt that anger falter. It melted not into tenderness, not yet, but into respect. A respect that demanded nothing, that spoke only of survival shared. He leaned back, the fire painting his face in shifting orange and shadow. She did not notice his gaze, or if she did, she gave no sign. The shawl rested across her shoulders, the braid marked his horse, and between them stretched silence that no longer felt like exile. They remained strangers in name. They did not share their pasts, did not speak of grief or of scars. Yet beneath the roof of that small cabin, Amid the snow and the wind and the faint crack of firewood, they began, slowly, wordlessly, to feel less alone. The storm had passed, but what it left behind was not ruin. It was something quieter, something waiting. Spring did not arrive gently. It came sudden, as if the desert, tired of frost and silence, broke open overnight. Snow melted into rivulets that cut dark lines across the earth. Buds appeared on stubborn shrubs, and the air softened with warmth that carried the scent of damp soil. Life stirred again, but with it came a stirring of other things, of old grudges, of dangers that had only been waiting for the thaw. Jonas sensed it before it came. He felt it in the restless shifting of his horse, in the unease that lingered when he walked the perimeter of the homestead. The memory of the drifter had not left him, nor the promise of vengeance flung into the storm. Winter had held that threat at bay, but seasons turn, and with them men return to settle their debts. The morning sky was bright when Jonas saw the riders cresting the ridge, 3 of them, with rifles slung low and faces hard with purpose. At their head was the drifter, hat pulled low, his grin sharp as a blade. Jonas's gut clenched. He counted the odds quickly and knew the truth. 3 against 1 was poor math. Yet retreat was no longer in him. This place, this roof, this woman, it was his, not by punishment, but by choice, and he would not yield it. He stepped inside, lifted the rifle from its stand, and set the axe by the door. His movements were calm, deliberate, though his chest thundered like the storm months before. Nayeli stood near the hearth, shawl wrapped close, her braid heavy across her shoulder. He opened his mouth to tell her to stay hidden, but the words died. Her eyes met his with a quiet that was resolute. She shook her head once, steady. She would not run, nor cower. She would stand. When the riders drew close, the drifter called out, his voice carrying across the open land. "Hale, you threw me out once, but a man doesn't forget insult. Time to teach you what it costs to keep what ain't yours." Jonas stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. "This land is mine. This roof is mine. And she," his voice sharpened, surprising even himself, "she is my wife. You'll not lay a hand here." The drifter laughed, the sound cruel and hollow. He raised his hand, and the fight began. Gunfire split the morning. Splinters flew from the porch rail. Jonas fired once, the recoil jarring his shoulder, and one rider tumbled from his horse, the animal screaming as it bolted. The other 2 dismounted fast, closing in with pistols drawn. The battle was not drawn out. It was fast, brutal, the kind of fight where every breath might be the last. Jonas swung the axe when a pistol flashed too close, burying its weight in wood and nearly in flesh. A fist slammed into his jaw, stars bursting in his vision. He grappled, teeth gritted, hands slick, with sweat and blood. It was then that Nayeli struck. An attacker had forced Jonas to the ground, blade glinting above. Before it could fall, Nayeli seized a heavy iron tool from the hearth, a poker still warm from the fire, and swung. It cracked against the man's skull with a sound final and sharp. He crumpled and Jonas rolled free, gasping. The drifter cursed, rage twisting his face. He fired wild, the bullet striking the barn door, wood shattering. Jonas shouldered his rifle and fired back, the shot grazing the man's arm. Blood blossomed across his sleeve. His bravado faltered, and with a last snarl, he scrambled for his horse. The remaining rider, shaken, followed without a word, and then it was over. The land fell still except for the ragged pant of horses fleeing across the ridge. Smoke curled from the rifle's barrel. The homestead bore scars, shattered, wood, broken rail, earth torn by hooves. Jonas leaned against the porch post, chest heaving. Sweat and blood mingled on his skin. Inside the cabin, Nayeli stood with the iron poker still in her hands. Her braid had come loose, strands of black falling across her face. Her chest rose and fell with the rhythm of survival, her silence ringing louder than any cry. Slowly, she set the poker down, her hands trembling only after the danger had passed. Jonas entered, closing the door behind him. The storm of battle gave way to a quiet so deep it felt almost sacred. He looked at her, truly looked, and saw, not punishment, not burden, but a woman who had stood beside him when death pressed close. By firelight that night, the air heavy with smoke and memory, Jonas finally broke the silence. His voice was rough, unused to honesty. "You saved me." Nayeli's gaze lifted, steady as the flame between them. Her words came soft, her accent curling around each syllable, but her meaning was clear. "We saved each other." The fire crackled. Outside, the land lay scarred but whole. Inside, something unspoken shifted, fragile as new grass breaking through frost. It was not passion, not yet love as the world would name it. It was something deeper, forged not by choice of others, but by their own. Born in fire, tempered in blood. Jonas leaned back, eyes on the flame, the weight in his chest no longer only grief. For the first time in years, it was also hope. Word of the fight traveled faster than the desert wind. By the time Jonas saddled his horse 2 mornings later, the story had already reached town, twisted and stretched in every retelling. Some said he had harbored savages and set them against decent men. Others whispered that he stood like a soldier once more alone against 3. But all agreed that blood had been spilled at his homestead, and in the hush of gossip, judgment sharpened its teeth. Jonas had no hunger for spectacle, yet he knew silence would not suffice. A man cannot live with shadows cast on his name, nor could he allow the woman beside him to remain a target of whispers. So he rode for town, rifle strapped behind his saddle, his jaw set like stone. Beside him, Nayeli rode astride his second horse, wrapped in the old shawl, her braid falling long and dark over her shoulder. She bore her silence like armor, her gaze steady on the road ahead. When they entered the settlement at midday, dust rising in their wake, conversation stilled. Men leaned against doorframes, women paused in their washing, children hushed. The saloon doors swung open, spilling smoke and curious eyes into the street. It was not Jonas alone they looked at, but the figure beside him, the woman they had once valued at $5, the woman now riding tall, unbroken. Jonas dismounted before the council hall, tying his horse with deliberate calm. Nayeli followed, her feet striking the boards with quiet grace. Inside, the councilmen waited, gray coats, hard eyes, the same faces that had sentenced him to humiliation months before. Their murmurs ceased as he entered, his shadow long across the wooden floor. He spoke without flourish, voice rough but steady. "You called it punishment," he said, eyes sweeping the room. "You thought to shame me and you thought to break her. But what you bound was not a sentence. It was a vow." He paused, the silence heavy. Nayeli stood at his side, her hands folded, her gaze unwavering. Jonas's voice deepened, each word slow as hammer on nail. "This woman is my wife, not by your decree, not by your coin, but by my word and by her strength. You traded her for $5 like she was nothing. But I tell you now, she is worth more than all of you combined." The hall grew still. Some men shifted uncomfortably, eyes dropping to the floorboards. Others swallowed, shame tightening their throats. None dared answer. The weight of their silence was louder than any denial, and in it, truth hung like a bell tolling clear. Jonas did not linger. He turned, placed a hand gently at Nayeli's back, and together they stepped out into the blinding sun. The townsfolk parted as they passed, their whispers hushed, their stares emptied of mockery. In that silence, dignity returned, not granted by others but claimed. They mounted their horses, the leather creaking beneath them, and without a word they rode homeward. Dust rose behind, swallowing the town, until all that remained was the wide desert and the steady rhythm of hooves carrying them back to where they belonged. Dusk met them at the homestead. The sky burned red, fading into violet shadows across the ridge. Jonas set to work at once, his hands mending the rocking chair splintered in the storm's chaos. Each nail driven was an act of reclamation, a piece of order restored. Nayeli sat, by the fire, braiding rope from spare fibers, her fingers deft, her posture calm. The shawl rested across her shoulders, glowing amber in the firelight. For a long time, neither spoke. The air carried the scent of pine smoke and cooling earth, the sound of hammer against wood mingling with the quiet rustle of her braid twisting into rope. Survival still pressed hard upon them. The land was no gentler, the nights no warmer. But something had shifted, something unshakable. Jonas set down the hammer, easing into the newly mended chair. It rocked slow, steady, as the firelight flickered across the room. His eyes rested on her, and though no words passed, a truth unspoken filled the space between them. She had come into his life as punishment, as shame. Yet now, as the evening deepened, he understood she was the only gift the world had left him. Nayeli lifted her gaze from her work, meeting his eyes. She did not smile, but her silence was full, not empty. In it lived endurance, companionship, the first tender roots of trust. The night settled. Stars pricked the vast sky, and the desert wind sighed across the land. Within the cabin, two figures sat, scarred again, yet unbowed. Their bond was not born of mercy from others, nor of fleeting passion, but of survival shared, of fire endured, of dignity reclaimed. What had begun as humiliation had become something far greater. A second chance, a home forged from silence and labor, a love that needed no proclamation. The chair creaked gently, the braid lengthened in her hands, the fire burned low. And in that quiet, their lives, once broken, once bartered, were joined, not by force, not by shame, but by choice.